Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina, where we're part of the ELCA. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I remember an event that happened several years ago. A woman in the church was attending a meeting and somehow caused quite a stir. Other women had a pretty strong reaction to what she did, and early the next morning, several had already been in my office to talk with me about it before 10 a.m. About an hour later, the woman herself came to see me and to talk about what happened. We talked for a while, and finally I suggested to her that her best course of action was on the upcoming Sunday, when it was time to share the peace, that she intentionally seek out some of those who were so upset and sincerely and humbly seek reconciliation with them. The woman stared at me as if I had lost my mind, and did not do that, and within a couple of months had found a different church. It was a very sad result, and it also points to how difficult reconciliation and forgiveness can be. It also points out how important it is. I'm calling this week of reflections Hidden Treasures, as we are looking at some often overlooked, or at least seldom looked at, books of the Bible. We may not encounter them often, but that doesn't mean they are unimportant. They have an important message to give. Today we find that message in the tiny book of Philemon. When I say it's a tiny book, it is. There aren't even chapters in this small letter sent by Paul, and it is only 25 verses long. Even more, it's not like the other letters of Paul that he wrote to churches to try to reach out about Jesus or their church community. Rather, it's a personal letter from Paul to one person concerning someone else. Paul wrote the letter to Philemon, who was a Christian. Paul had converted to the faith. Paul had gone on to other places to preach and tell about Jesus, and in his journeys he encountered another man, Onesimus, and converted him to Christianity too. Onesimus joined with Paul in his missionary work and was a great help to Paul. However, at some point, Paul discovered that Onesimus was, in fact, a runaway slave. This was a serious matter in those days, and if Onesimus returned to his master, he could be punished or even killed. Then Paul discovered that Onesimus had belonged to Philemon. So Paul wrote a letter to Philemon and gave it to Onesimus to take to Philemon. In the letter, Paul speaks of how helpful Onesimus had been to him, and begs Philemon to receive Onesimus back as a Christian brother. He urged Philemon to forgive and reconcile with Onesimus, and for them to honor each other as fellow Christians. And that's it. We don't really know what happened after that. One small hint might be that 50 years later, the bishop in Ephesus is named Onesimus. We don't know if it's the same man, but what a great outcome for forgiveness and reconciliation if it were. Still, we are left with the question, with all the great and important things that Paul wrote that are in the Bible, why is this short personal letter there too? Well, there is much to chew on in these few verses for how we live as Christians together. First, the story of Philemon and Onesimus shows how the gospel reshapes relationships. Those who had once been master and slave are now brothers in Christ. Those old class distinctions are put aside. We are alike in our need for God's grace and alike in receiving God's grace. In other places, Paul points out that in Christ there is no longer Jew and Gentile, slave or free, male or female, and that all are one in Christ Jesus. The tiny book of Philemon begins to teach us the importance of reconciliation and how that is lived out together in the church. We learn forgiveness is rooted in Christ. We learn that brotherhood and sisterhood replaces the normal social hierarchy. We learn that Christian love overcomes social power. In other words, living out the gospel means seeing others as equals in Christ and pursuing reconciliation. To do this requires a strong sense of humility and an awareness of our own need for forgiveness. That's hard for us too. One of my favorite stories is about the priest in the Philippines, a much loved man of God who carried the burden of a secret sin he had committed many years before. He had repented but still had no peace, no sense of God's forgiveness. In his parish was a woman who deeply loved God and who claimed to have visions in which she spoke with Christ and he with her. The priest, however, was skeptical. To test her, he said, "The next time you speak with Christ, I want you to ask him what sin your priest committed while he was in seminary." The woman agreed. A few days later, the priest asked, "Well, did Christ visit you in your dreams?" "Yes, he did," she replied. "And did you ask him what sin I committed in seminary?" "Yes." "Well, what did he say?" "He said, 'I don't remember.'" That's the grace we have received, and that's the grace in which we are to live. Why is the tiny book of Philemon in the Bible? It reminds us of that grace received. It reminds us that that's the grace we are called to live. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.